Hello and welcome to Audiobook Reviews. In this review, I'll be discussing Kill Bill. Wait, no, that's not right. I'll be discussing the $6 Million Man. Wait a minute. That's not right either. The Princess Bride? Oh, no, I'm sorry. In this review, I'll be discussing Best Served Cold, one of the standalone novels following the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. Now, I start this way in good fun, but Joe Abercrombie has shown that he's going to continue to be an author who writes beautiful novels, fantastic prose, great work with characters, but somehow still manages to disappoint me so much. Only you, Joe Abercrombie, only you. Best Served Cold follows Manza and a group of other individuals as she embarks upon her quest to get revenge on Duke Orso, who betrayed her, and everyone else who was in the room at the time. We get to see a lot of minor characters or secondary characters from the First Law trilogy reappear, including Shivers from the North, Vitari, who originally was working for the Inquisition and then kind of moved out of that role as well. We get to see Nakoma Koska again, uh, who was in turn betrayed by Manza. And so we get a little bit of those events. This ends up taking place at least a few years after the First Law trilogy, based on some other bits and pieces mentioned there. But it takes place in Styria, which we'd heard a bit, mostly from Koska talking about it. We know that Jezzel had married the Jewel of Talons, who was one of the daughters of Duke Orso. And so this is something we're kind of visiting here for the first time, even though we've talked about it a little bit. And that's really the main focus of the book. Now, the first thing I want to say is I 110% thought this was going to be a standalone novel about Pharaoh. Pharaoh, as I mentioned in my other videos about the First Law trilogy, didn't really seem to do much. She was kind of there. She served her purpose and then went off to get revenge against the Gurkish. And then we don't really hear from her. And I was a bit disappointed. I didn't really care that much for Pharaoh as a character, mostly because she just was largely ignored, despite technically being one of the main characters in the First Law trilogy. She was introduced much later, didn't have as much development going on, didn't really have a satisfying ending. So knowing that this was a novel with this title, this is where I thought we were going to get that closure, and that doesn't happen. We do get, I want to note as well, though never by name, we do get Jezzel talked about several times. We actually briefly see him in this book, which makes sense in his capacity as king. We do get to hear about Glockta as well. Once again, never by name, but definitely mentioned. We get to hear about Logan, also mentioned specifically as the Bloody Nine. And so kind of we're living in the shadow of these really important people. Pharaoh, one single line in the book, also not by name, one single line that I assume was referencing her is mentioned. So once again, just a little disappointing that we're not hearing any more about Pharaoh. I thought this would really be the chance to give it some closure. But we do follow Manza, so we're following this woman in her quest for revenge. And once again, Abercrombie is just fantastic with his characters. He really does a good job starting her as kind of the new character with people that we already know to an extent. We get a lot more development of Shivers. He's come from the North to Styria attempting to be a better man. We get a bit more on Vitari, though not really a whole lot. We already kind of knew very little about her, and she's around, but doesn't have really a lot of development from her. Mostly Manza and Shivers are the ones we're really following. We get some point of views from a new character, Morvir, who's a master poisoner, and we also get some more point of views from Koska, and get to learn more about the history of what happened between him and Manza, why he had left Styria to begin with, why we saw him in Dagoska in the second book of the First Law trilogy. So we see a lot there. Now, the overall story is good, and the writing, like I commented, Joe Abercrombie's a fantastic writer. His prose is great. I've never had a problem with that or with the characters, but plot seems to get away from him sometimes. This book, since it is really following one main quest, we see the quest here. All the characters are together for the most part. We don't really have very many scenes whatsoever that don't involve the characters that are all in the same place. We get some flashback scenes as well explaining the backstory. But something that really annoyed me here, and this was something similar as in the last book of the trilogy, there's so many things that are, I guess, foreshadowed, but they're done very heavy-handedly, and it's almost as if he's condescending to the reader, like, you're not going to get this until I actually outright say it later. And that's something that happened multiple times with some of the twists or with some of the reveals. They really were very obvious, but it was still kind of put as like, oh, you're not going to find this out until later. Now, there were a couple of twists that did really come out of nowhere, some good, some bad, which I'll also get to. One which also goes back to what I feel like Abercrombie does with trying to tie things together when they don't necessarily need to be tied together. With that introduction, I'm going to get into the spoiler section, talking about some specific examples of the things I've introduced and getting into a lot more detail. If you want to skip the spoiler section, check the description. I will have a timestamp there that you can skip past to get to the end where I summarize and give kind of my final thoughts here. That said, we are now going to get started with spoilers. So, I won't condescend to think you didn't get the references at the beginning of the video. The reason I did that is because this does seem to really throw in a lot of tropes and start out in a very cliche, tropey type way. I had to stop and think, am I reading Guards by Terry Pratchett again? Because the first scene where Monza is going to be betrayed, it first starts off with her and who you find out is her brother, and immediately, like, the relationship does not seem brother sister. That's one thing. Later, it's supposed to be a twist that they were lovers and that her brother was actually the person who did all the betraying and she didn't. And it's pretty evident right off the bat. The interaction does not make sense for a brother and sister, and they hint at it several other times through the text. But it's not until the very end, the final confrontation, that some of it's brought up that he did the betraying, and it's not until quite late in the book that it's actually confirmed that they were lovers. But once again, it just wasn't really that surprising from the very first scene. It was like, oh, they've got a weird thing going on. Gotcha. Okay. Not really a surprise later on when it brings back. But that aside, going in, they go up, they're talking to Dugorso, and they have this scene where it has the classic betrayal and they take them out and it's, oh, never trust them and blah blah blah, and just the whole thing seems just very derivative. It really does. And she's tossed down the mountain. Then luckily they can rebuild her. They have the technology. Some guy who we find out more later, which I'm gonna touch on here toward the end of the spoiler section, but it picks her up and she's got like all of her bones shattered practically, and he's a bone scientist and is able to stitch her up and repair a lot of the damage. And so she wakes up. It's been weeks. She can't really walk, and after a while, she escapes. She had stolen a huge fortune of gold, luckily, so she had resources to get started, and she starts on her revenge. That and then Shiver shows up and immediately starts talking about the stink of Talons, and that just also made me think of Ankh-Mor Pork. But it really starts with kind of a cliche, and unfortunately, that's something that keeps going on throughout. There are so many cliche scenes, and it's really disappointing because the First Law Trilogy really tried to not do that. It did not go with the cliches. There were a lot of things different. We even have, and this is brought up in the book too, Nine Fingers, who makes the comment, if you're going to kill somebody, best just kill them, don't talk about it. But in this book, for the most part, it's ignored. And in the classic kind of movie sense, anytime one character is about to kill the other, they have to wait, they have to talk, and usually it's a way for Manza to somehow not be killed. very quickly the stakes are just kind of gone because you see that we're going to do these classic tropey things where Monza's never actually going to be in any danger. This includes one of the worst offenders, and what immediately brought my mind to The Princess Bride, when she is fighting with Ganmark, and they're in a palace from one of the other dukes, and she had to start fighting left-handed because she injured her right hand at the very beginning. And so he also fights left-handed. They start left-handed fighting, and then they have that scene where she switches over to the right, and he's like, "Oh, we're switching to right now." Oh, and it's just very much, and I don't know if some of these things are intentional, but it just makes the story cheesy, and it makes it so that it seems like the story doesn't know what it wants to be. It wants to be this gritty revenge novel in the First Law world, which was very dark, but it's filled with so many cheesy revenge tropes, it takes away from it. Here as well, Monza's fighting. She knows she's going to lose, but then Koska shows up in the nick of time, and still he's not able to quite save her. But this conspicuous statue with a sword ends up falling over and impaling him, and just, yeah, of course it did, because he wasn't going to have everything work out and get away with it. You can't have Monza die. Now, this did lead to the twist where you think Koska is dead. Now, I feel like I should have seen this one coming actually a little bit, but for once, Abercrombie didn't lay the references on thick. There was one small passage where Friendly decides he's going to leave because he hasn't heard back from Sajam, who was his employer. We know because him and all his people are dead at this point, but he sees somebody he knows and he stops. That ends up being Koska. It was just that one little thing. So later on, when we find out Koska's still alive, it was a really nice reveal. That was one of the few twists I felt that actually worked and had some payoff because it wasn't just shoved down your throat and made so blatantly obvious as to kind of just ruin the twist. But with that, they're also, Mons and Shivers at one point before that battle are captured and they're going to be tortured, and Shivers loses an eye, but once again, you just know Mons is not actually going to have anything happen. Even though they questioned her first and they questioned Shivers, they of course started on her, and because it was shown to you, we already know Koska's come in and he's about to save the day here as well. There's so many instances where you're told details and you see people doing things that ruin the surprise. It'd be a little bit better, but we already know. Why are we worried about this? Because we already know what's happening here. During the whole scene where it seems like Monza could die fighting Ganmark and you have Koska, we already know from behind the scenes that Morvier and Vitari are mounting a rescue operation, even though the main characters don't know. We're constantly told there's these ways out, and so there are simply no stakes, and Mons is going to survive. She's eventually going to get her revenge. It might not all happen the way that she wants, but it's going to happen because you constantly are shown it. And when you have this sort of thing and you have no stakes, it just kind of takes you a little bit out of it. There are a lot of deaths later on, but even then, you're kind of also shown, and it really pulls you out when you already know what's going to happen. The scene at the end where Morvier has turned against them, and he's hired by Urso to kill basically all of the nobility who's against him. We're kind of we know he's already done something, and we're not specifically told what he did, but it becomes very evident once you find out what's in the box, and they all die but Monza. But she keeps going on. We even have Shivers turn on Monza, and he's trying to kill her, but he gets in a fight with Friendly. Neither one of them die. They're stopped by Shanked, who I have a lot of problems with that I will be talking about next, who, after Shivers is already near death, he throws him across a room, and he's, should be dead, but of course he's not. Can't get to Monza, and he shows up just in time to stop Monza from being killed, and so she could kill Orso. And it's because, of course, why wouldn't he? And that gets to one of my biggest issues with the book, which was Shanked. We're introduced to him a little bit later in the book after Duke Orso realizes that Monza is still alive and is coming after him and taking out his sons and taking out his generals and all his people. And doing that. And he's one of many assassins. He's apparently this renowned assassin, and he's like the best that there is, and he takes the job. We see him kind of lazily track, and at one point he kills a bunch of other assassins because he doesn't want them to get to Monza and Shivers first, but then doesn't really make any attempt to actually go get them that hard. Just seems to really not be trying a whole lot. And we see every now and then him following up, getting closer, and once again, never really making a huge effort, it seems, even though he's amazing. He just goes around questioning people and then killing them. And that's what he does. We find out later he apparently is married to Vitari and the father of her children, which makes absolutely no sense and causes a lot of problems for the events in the First Law Trilogy, because if Vitari was married to Shankt, who is a master assassin and obviously an eater, yeah, spoiler, not really. We're already in the spoiler section, but from the moment we see Shanked and see him first kill people, it's really evident he's an eater. But it's not specifically said until later when you see him getting ready to eat human flesh, and it's just like, yeah, that's we got it. He's very obviously an eater. Yeah, nobody else fights like that. But why, if this was the case, because we know Vitari already had her children in the main trilogy, so why was he not around to help all of the times that she was in danger and it would have made sense? Especially at the end, we find out he apparently used to be an apprentice of Bayaz. He has kind of a run-in with Sulfur, who's been around a bit as well, and he essentially just wants to stop anything that Bayaz or the Prophet want to do and just kind of get in their way. So he knew that Duke Orso was completely under Valentin Bach, which we know is Bayaz, essentially his bank that he runs to control the world. And so he wanted to make sure that Monza took over, and he apparently was the bone scientist to begin with. So problems with that is he apparently wanted to make sure that Monza was alive, but like I said, doesn't really seem to make any sort of effort to go help. She could have died at any point, and there were so many points where she probably should have died, except for the tropes of we're gonna talk or I'm gonna slow it down and explain everything that's wrong with you and why I beat you, all of that happening. Like she could have and should have died at any point, and he didn't care that much then, but apparently did really have an interest in keeping her alive. And just the whole thing, too, it is such a stretch. Why does he have to be connected to Vitari? That's not something that's needed. It doesn't really make any sense because of the fact that he's never been around before. He apparently just he's very against Bayaz and Khalul, and his spare time has decided to become an assassin. Why? Why not use all of his effort to go against Bayaz and Khalul if that's his life's work? Why not spend time with his family and or do that? Why is it just he's got to do all these other things and it just doesn't work? And it seems to be it's once again trying to tie it all together. Oh, the random bone scientist who made no sense and was such a stretch, and well, that's why, because he knows magic and is an eater and all that. So, of course, he can put all the bones back together because, along with being the world's best assassin and actively working against Bayas and Klul, which has to take up a lot of time, he's also made an extensive study of bones and occasionally also has to go visit his family, and it's just crap. The Shanked plotline was not needed. It did not add anything. All it was a way for Monza to survive at the end of the book and to survive at the beginning, I suppose. Just really didn't work for me. So I know I've done a lot of complaining about these spots, but it's similar issues I had with the last argument of Kings. It's just Abercrombie is trying to do too much. He's trying to tie it all together. He's trying to have these crazy twists, and a lot of it just doesn't really work. And I think that's the biggest area that he needs to work on as an author. Now, I know he is a newer author. The First Law Trilogy was his first published work, so it's still early in his career, and I definitely think he has time to grow. I've heard very good things about his new trilogy he's working on as well. And I'm still going to read the other standalone novels, but I'm really hoping for some improvement on these areas I've had problems with because the books are good. Even the slower parts, books 1 and 3 of First Law, they're still written very well. The characters are great. They're really good. They're really enjoyable to read. There's just things put in there that aren't needed, I'd really take away from all of that goodness. And that's kind of why I said Joe Abercrombie has that gift of being a very talented author, writes very enjoyable books, and still gets me disappointed with these things that he does. So I'm hoping to not find them as much in the next books. This book really, like I've alluded to already, it just seems like it doesn't know what it wants to be. It's trying to be gritty, and then it's trying to throw in comic relief, and then it just has these cheesy action movie tropes, these cheesy revenge movie tropes, and it's just really not needed. I don't know if having this be kind of gritty spoof was intended, but that's what it comes out of. And it's done very well, but I think focusing more on and making it a little bit more original and having a little bit of less of these tropes, having it really stay in its lane, not trying to go above what's needed, I think would have really helped this novel. If you like the First Law Trilogy, you're gonna like this. It's the same very good writing style, it's the same great character work, and it has the same problems. So if you didn't mind them in the First Law, you won't mind them here. Or if you're like me and do mind them, you won't mind them enough to not read the book and continue reading Abercrombie's works. The one final thing I do want to mention as well is even the name, Best Served Cold, which is a very cliche, revenge is a dish best served cold. It's a line everyone's heard a million times. And even that is just a little disappointing because I loved the names of the first trilogy. The Blade itself, Before They're Hanged, The Last Argument of Kings, they were all coming from quotes too, and Abercrombie likes to put his quotes in between sections of the book. But Best Served Cold is, yeah, granted, it's still technically a quote, but that one has just kind of been sent to death, so also just seemed very cliche name, which granted ended up fitting the pretty cliche story. That said, that's my review of Best Served Cold. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like. And if you want to see other reviews like this, then feel free to subscribe as I do post new reviews at least every Friday.